Jetzt leider nicht verstanden, aber ich glaube, Sie sind gehört worden. After this brilliantly elaborated, intense, challenging, yet hopeful, it was certainly not a nightmare you presented, but a rather hopeful keynote of Kumi Naidoo, I'm trying to leapfrog all of us into our first panel here. And I have the pleasure to moderate it. My name is Kirsten Mansalbert. I'm heading the Africa department here at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Kumi Naidoo will join us on this panel. That's the empty seat here to my right for him, once we open the floor to you for the Q&A and questions. So if there's questions about his keynote presentation, he's there for the Q&A. But let me start this first panel, the GDP mantra and leadership challenges, by very, very briefly, because we're already running a bit late, our distinguished speakers here with me, and by giving you a little update on the changes on this panel. I'm sure my colleagues in the back there are trying to get a Skype conference working, because Lorenzo Fioramonti, who is in your program, could unfortunately not travel from South Africa. But luckily has agreed to give us input via Skype. So I do hope our technical equipment is not failing us. Lorenzo Fioramonti is Associate Professor and Jean Monnet Chair in Regional Integration and Governance Studies at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's also directing the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation. His 2013 published book on GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, was already promoted by Kumi Naidoo. Therefore, I won't stop the introduction, Lorenzo, by saying that you just published a new book, which is called How Numbers Rule the World, the Use and Abuse of Statistics in Global Politics. And I would say the two books are a must for those who want to understand how our fate is determined by a few numbers, which are determined by a few people. Joel Kibazo, who was also in the program we invited you with and was announced as a speaker on this panel, has just taken up a new position as Director of Communications and External Affairs at the African Development Bank in Tunis, and had to pull out from this forum, unfortunately, due to upcoming commitments in his new job. However, on the sunny side of today's bright day, we have Mark Haywood, also from South Africa. And Mark, I'm very, very grateful that you came in on very short notice to be speaking. Mark Haywood is Executive Director of Section 27, a public interest law center in South Africa that seeks to influence, develop, and use the law to protect, promote, and advance human rights. Can you hear me better now? I'm getting signals that I'm not really speaking into the microphone. Section 27 is named after the particular section in the South African Constitution which lies at the heart of the Supreme Law's commitment to socio-economic rights. Briefly, Franklin Obengodom, to my left, is the Chancellor's postdoctoral research fellow at the School of the Built Environment at the University of Technology in Sydney. His research interests are centered on the political economy of development, cities, and natural resources. He has published research on governance for pro-poor urban development, specifically in Ghana, and his most recently published book, Oiling the Urban Economy, Land, Labor, Capital, and the State in Sekondi Takoradi, Ghana, is representative of his research interest on the political economy of extractive industries. Last but certainly not least, Robert Kappel, to my right. In Germany, I think nobody has written and spoken more in recent years on the issue of Africa on the rise, on wrong assumptions and real economies than Robert Kappel. An economist himself, he's also known to many of you in the room as the former president and since 2011 senior research fellow at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, GIGA. And as such, Kappel continues to enlighten us all on economic developments in Africa, as well as on BRICS and global power shifting. His latest contribution concerning our issue today, titled Africa, Neither Hopeless Nor Rising, has just come out with the GIGA International edition. You can look it up on the internet. It's also in our book table out there. Lorenzo, we welcome you via Skype. How are you?
Good, good. Welcome, everyone. Thank you
Fine.
for inviting me.
Great. We can hear you, so all seems fine. I want to start with you and want us all start looking a little bit further into the GDP mantra. Gross domestic product is arguably one of the most powerful statistics in this globalized world. It drives government policies, sets priorities, and it determines perspectives and discourses on this world's regions. Yet it has, in recent times, come to be regarded by a widening range of people, commissions, and institutions as misguiding. Lorenzo, why is GDP, the icon of economic growth, a problem?
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for the question. And I'm glad that actually initially you immediately said gross domestic problem rather than product, because I'm happy that the acronym is maybe changing in the global debate. I mean, I see it. I have Google alerts that tell me every month how many people are using new acronyms to describe GDP. GDP has become a problem because it's a fundamentally misleading and myopic measure of economic performance. Okay, this is really important. I'm not even discussing whether it's a measure of social well-being or progress. Even just as a measure of economic performance is pretty myopic. It does not look at a lot of activities in society that add value, economic value to our lives. It only looks at the formal market transactions that happen within the formal economy. And this is a very restrictive outlook on what the economy is. In some countries, for instance, the so-called informal economy or the household economy, what we do for one another without an exchange of money, is really, really important, has a significant economic impact. And yet it's totally disregarded by GDP. Now what happens? You may say, well, but GDP is only looking at a small portion of what the economy is. Fine, but when GDP is then used to design policies around the world, what happens is that our governments will only focus on rewarding those sectors that count for GDP and disregarding, neglecting, or even oppressing those economic sectors that are not included in GDP. This is what economists call the asset and production boundaries. Okay, GDP eliminates certain sectors, only looks at some of them, and as a consequence, all our societal and political focus is on what is calculated as part of GDP. This has terrible effects. It makes us unable to understand the importance of different types of non-monetary components of society, and because it doesn't calculate all the environmental consequences of conventional industrialization, it makes us feel that we're growing in certain sectors of the economy when at the end of the day, often we're not growing. We're actually going to have to pay more to clean up the mess caused by certain economic sectors, especially in the environmental fields, than the money that is formally produced by GDP. So, and this is to say, when this, the issue of GDP as a problem is becoming more and more current in the whole world. Actually, European Union was among the first institutions to start putting the issue out there, like to start discussing whether GDP was appropriate as a measure of economic performance back in 2007. Nowadays, there is more and more consensus that GDP has to be overcome. The GDP was always inappropriate, and it's definitely become more and more inappropriate nowadays. Now, when it comes to Africa, GDP is extremely misleading because of all the reasons that I've said, besides the fact that our GDP data is also very poor quality because of the limited statistical capacity of many African governments. I mean, I advise African governments on a monthly basis on how to rethink their national income accounts. And most of them tell me, we only have 4 or 5, up to 6 people at times working on GDP, and we cannot measure anything else just because all our people are measuring this number. So we cannot measure other things like, I don't know, environmental degradation of the economic impact of the household economy or the informal economy because we simply don't have enough resources. Now, this becomes a social justice issue then. If all our focus is on GDP, if all our focus is on something that tells us very little about the type of economy that we want, we do not have the time the headspace, the human resources to measure anything else. And in the case of Africa, this is creating this duality between this whole Africa rising mantra, issues around, like how Africa is progressing, whether Africa is progressing in a certain direction, and this whole enthusiasm around African economic growth, which you see reflected in the World Economic Forum's reports, in the different cover pages of The Economist, of Time, and so on and so forth, and the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that African economies are often worse off than before, because most of their economic growth is due to a systematic exploitation of natural resources. Now, as you all know very well, exploiting natural resources has got two problems. One is that most of these natural resources are not growing back. Once you run out of them, you run out of them. Secondly, it's that most of them are exported overseas, so they're not even used to build the infrastructure or the social development that may be needed in Africa itself. And on top of this, they create environmental consequences, social consequences that then African states, African governments have to pay for. So, so if you look at GDP, then in some African countries, there are good stories. I mean, I usually make the example of Libya. Libya in 2012 grew by 129%, the highest rate of growth experienced all over the world. But of course, what was that figure telling us was that Libya had a civil war, destroyed everything, and as soon as it started reconstructing, economic growth went up. Now, this is an extreme case, but it can be said, can be applied to many other African countries: Angola, Chad, the DRC, Niger, and so on and so forth. All these countries, Equatorial Guinea, have surprisingly high economic growth rates. But when we look at what happens, what are the real costs of that model of growth, simply by calculating how much it costs, for instance, to clean up an oil field, or to clean up the environmental consequences of the extraction of coal, besides platinum and all the things that then we use for our cell phones and so on and so forth, we realize actually that the costs in the medium to long term will be much higher than even the money made out of selling those resources to overseas investors. Now, it goes without saying that this cannot be a good measure of economic growth. If we sell something that is not renewable, first of all, it means that we're not going to be able to keep growing at that rate in the future. And secondly, if we sell something that we're going to have to pay twice as much to reinstate in the future, it's like, I make the example of selling organs. If I sell my organs, I may feel that I'm rich now, but in the future, I'm going to have to repay all that money plus the interest. So the issue is that if we use that GDP figure in economies that are highly informal, in which the concentration of wealth is extremely unequal, as it is in many African countries, which is a consequence of that type of growth, we end up with wrong policies. And when that happens, we put our societies on a trajectory of development that is actually very myopic and short-term, and doesn't take into consideration what our countries, what our continent needs in the long term. So we're trying to advocate in Africa a reflection on the type of metrics and measures that we want, that we need to be able to guide policies in the right direction.
Thank you very much. We're taking this for now. If the Skype connection allows, it would be great if you can stay with us, also for the later Q&A. If it collapses, we will try and get back to you. If not, thank you for this first input. We're right there. We're right at the continent. And I think the Libya example showed that the continent Africa, because we talk about Africa as a complex Africa on the rise, this continent should obviously, as many of us understand, not be seen as a single unit. It comprises, as Kuminaidu, I think, mentioned earlier, 54 very different countries and economies, each with its own history and very different strength. And we should also not forget, as I think Lorenzo also tried to point out, that Africa is not divorced from international competition and markets. So I want to ask Robert Kappel, how diverse is economic development on the African country, on the African continent, and what does that mean for the bigger picture?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for this question, and thank you also, Barbara, for your introductory notes, and also our colleague Kumi Naidu. That was very inspiring. I also agree with Lorenzo Fiorentino, sorry, which says that we cannot take these data. Nevertheless, because I'm an orthodox economist, I will use these data. But one word about statistics. 15 years ago, Easterly and Levine published an article called Africa's Growth Tragedy. Since then, growth has picked up, averaging 5 to 6% a year, and so on and so forth. The statistical tragedy is that we cannot be sure that this is true. Because take economic growth, which is measured in terms of GDP growth. GDP in turn is measured by national accounts. While there has been some progress today, only 35% of all Africa's population lives in countries that use a similar UN statistical system of national accounts. The others use earlier systems, some dating back to the 1990s. So it's 1960s. You cannot compare the data. The tragedy is that we are happily pushing GDP statistics and growth figures. The proximate causes of the problem with statistics are weak capacity in countries to collect, manage, and disseminate data, inadequate funding, diffuse responsibilities, and fragmentation with many diffuse data collection efforts. Nevertheless, I will use the data, and I will focus my presentation on 4 questions. How diverse is economic development in Africa, as I was asked by Kerstin? Second question, is foreign direct investment an indicator that sub-Saharan Africa is gaining ground on the world stage? Third question, what has to be changed to achieve sustained growth, and who should be the driving forces? What role for the governments? So we have diverse economic, first I start with the economic development. There is a diversity of development paths, also coming from a long-term path dependence since colonialism. This should not be forgot, and there's not so much change to be open. Many sub-Saharan countries are in fact demonstrating positive growth rates, but only resource economies realized growth rates of about 6 to 8%, as was mentioned, during the last 10 years. Low-income countries, landlocked countries, and fragile states have much less growth rates of about 3 to 5% or less, even less. Per capita income in growth is much lower because of high population growth. And this is also a very important topic, always forgot. Well, we have, we have 2 main views on African developments. There are these optimists. They say Africa, there is a takeoff in Africa, there is high GDP growth, and export growth also is very high. Poverty is on the decline, and all indicators are improved. The glass is half full. Then we have these pessimists. They argue growth depends on high prices of raw materials. There is no structural change, no industrial developments, corruption is high, inadequate infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And they say the glass is half empty. Berthe Pfeiffer and I tried to differentiate and developed a performance indicator for most of the sub-Saharan countries where we have data. For instance, South Sudan, we don't have any data. Eritrea is complicated. Zimbabwe is very complicated. Based on a principal component analysis, we could rank African countries as part of a bigger sample of 106 countries, developing countries. The goal was to carry out a comprehensive assessment of the countries with as small a number of individual indicators as possible. To that end, 6 dimensions were set out for an indicator catalog which covered fundamental aspects of the definition of competitiveness, all based in theoretical discussion. Economic development, level of financial development, infrastructure, institutional framework, level of education, market openness, and governance. In the sample we have, in the sample for African countries, we have included 42 African countries, and we developed this performance index Africa PR. Okay, what does the ranking show? The PR ranking shows that we have some countries on the top, Seychelles, Mauritius, South Africa, Botswana, Cape Verde, Namibia, and so on and so forth. And then we have at the bottom many Sahel countries and landlocked countries, starting with Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Burundi, and so on and so forth. So we can say that we have some top performers, and when we compare 106 developing nations, that then we can demonstrate that the majority of African countries fall somewhere between ranking 70 and 106 out of 106, meaning that the majority of African countries are not currently experiencing a rise. Rather, they have dropped down to below the level of most other developing countries. The ranking is seen here. We have these top performers on the top of the 106 countries, Seychelles, Mauritius, South Africa, and so on and so forth. But most African countries belong to the group of this, the bottom group of all developing countries. You can see this list here. Let me also talk about foreign direct investment as an indicator for attractiveness. There we see that FDI flows to Africa were about 43 billion in 2011, marking a third successive year of decline, not an increase. Both cross-border mergers and acquisitions and greenfield investment by foreign transnational corporations decreased in terms of share in global FDI flows. The whole continent position diminished from 3.3% in 2010 to 2.8% in 2011. So it's just a minor player in when you compare global foreign direct investment. Viewed over a longer time of period, a discernible sector shift is taking place in FDI in Africa. The relative importance of the primary sector is somehow declining. I will not go into detail because there are some sectors in the economy which are interesting also for foreign direct investments. For instance, tourism is quite interesting, hotels, also consumer production, and these more service-related sectors. So we can say the shift is more about diversification of natural resource-related activities than a decline of the extractive industry. This table shows where how big the FDI inflows for all African countries. There we have some top countries: Nigeria, South Africa, and Ghana. Then some countries following: Congo, Mozambique, and so on and so forth. And then we have a list of not so much performing countries below 100 million per year. That's the foreign direct investment in small and medium German towns like Osnabrück and Wilhelmshaven. They have higher foreign direct investment than 1/3 of the African countries. That's perhaps not so important, but we can see that Africa has a long way to go when we regard FDI, and we should not forget, we're talking here about FDI, but we should not forget local investment. Local investment is much more important than FDI. When you see the investment and savings rate in African countries, there's also a slight rise, and that's also a good sign for African development. What should be changed? I'm very, thank you for the rose, no rose, tulip, only tulip, thank you. What should be changed? Who should be the driving forces? Of course, I can only be very, very, very simple. What can be said? Recent growth paths are not sustainable and not poverty reducing and not supporting industrial development. Instead, deepening asymmetries coming from colonialism until today, inequality and social unrest. What is most important? Reduced fragility. State failure and so on, that's the most important. Peace is most important for Africa's development. Without peace, nothing works. Second, foster structural change, industrialization. What is needed is industrialization, and foreign and local development should flow in the industry, and also in agriculture, agri-industry, light industry, industrial zones, and small and medium-sized businesses. Also integration into the global value chains and also regional value chains, which are of major importance. Only with industrialization, to be very clear, the number of jobs which have to be created on the African continent, 8 million unemployed people every year in the market. Without industrialization, nothing works. You can have much more FDI in resources, in raw materials production, and so on and so forth. Without industrialization, nothing will happen to reduce poverty. What is needed? Give incentives for industrial development, production zone, industrial cluster, value chain integration. My two last sentences, what is also needed is that the state invest in infrastructure and better education and health, and also intra-regional infrastructure that will support intra-regional trade, and so that the neighboring countries can benefit also from your activities. I will not go into detail. You can see what I have written. There is a certain geographical isolation of many Sahel countries, landlocked countries, that should be tackled and is very important. Last point, I have read many articles during the last months on population and population growth, fertility, and so on and so forth. And what is missing in many of the activities, also on the developed countries in cooperation with African countries, is family planning. Many say youth is our future, but the problem is youth without any employment is not the future. So what we need is a demographic transition. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Robert Kappel, for a tour de force of putting in more and differentiated data, and also for bringing in some ideas of what needs to change. The PR, this performance index you've laid out for us, is certainly worthwhile looking at in depth, because it's an interesting combination of factors. We try to visualize it. You find in your folder, you find a couple of graphics, and one of the graphics, the dominantly red and orange one, is on the PR, so you might continue looking at it. I want to take us a little step back again and ask Franklin Obengo-Dome. We've heard from Lorenzo, also partly from Robert Kappel, that what really measures growth has become questionable. We're also witnessing various attempts to bring together internationally comparable measures of well-being in line with the concerns that standards of macroeconomic statistics like GDP fail to give a true account of people's current and future well-being. So I want to ask you, does our quality of life, of our life reality, improve when our economic growth reaches 1 or 2 or even 6%? And do such concepts as gross national happiness or a better life index, as was recently introduced by the OECD, do they serve as better concepts, or as useful concepts at least?
Well, Kirsten, according to my rigorous mathematical models, that's what it should be. But don't ask me about life outside the models, because as a Nobel Prize winner in economic science, I don't respond to questions about the real world. That is not my answer to you. That is an answer that Professor Gerald Debreu gave to Australian journalists when he won the Nobel Prize and he went to Australia to celebrate. Of course, my answer to you is rather different. As a student of political economy, I'm more interested in the embeddedness of the economy in broad social and ecological relations. From that perspective, I would say that the nexus between growth and well-being is contingent rather than categorical. So if growth, is inclusive, is ecologically sustainable, it brings jobs, then, well, we could go for a walk in the park, at least for a while. And that seems to be what is happening in Mauritius and Botswana, and according to Robert's data, probably in Seychelles. In these countries, growth has come with fall in unemployment levels and poverty levels, and at least in the case of Mauritius, a fall in inequality levels as well. But that cannot, the same thing cannot be said of countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Zambia, where growth seems to have been enclaved, exploitative and expropriative. And so for these countries, growth is something to mourn rather than celebrate. In Nigeria, once again, with such a mighty country with growth, the levels of pollution or the ecological crisis have remained, probably even worsened. But there's even a more disturbing aspect to it. The growth mantra or the growth speak doesn't tell us much about rural and urban life. But this aspect is also important, particularly because the population on the African continent, or the share of the population on the African continent that is becoming more and more urban is increasing. But I think the former boss of the UN Habitat once said that we should no longer just describe the African population as Homo sapiens, but we should describe the population as Homo urbanus, because it's becoming more and more urban. So from this angle, it's important to know what is happening to urban and rural life, but the growth mantra doesn't tell us much about this aspect. Of course, I think cities like Johannesburg calculate city-based GDP, but growth will always tell us just that, growth. Matters of distribution or ethical questions about distribution and ecological concerns are never captured. To illustrate my point, Ghana seems to be doing really well. Sometime in 2011, I think was growing around 14.4%. Not as high as the 120% in Libya, but it was growing really, really fast. That was with oil. Without it, it was growing around 7.4%. That has reduced a little bit, but still, with oil, Ghana is growing really fast. And well, the minister goes to Parliament to celebrate this in the annual budget. One politician even described the oil industry as an ATM machine. But looking at what's happening in the oil region, the Western region also can do credit to be a little bit more precise. Inequality in the distribution of jobs within the region, in the city and other regions and other cities is not captured in the growth mantra. Inequality within the city and the region is not captured. Inequality between the indigenous people of the region and the city and immigrants is not captured in the growth speak. And inequality between genders is not captured in the growth mantra either, although oil has come with, has benefited aspects of the economy or sectors of the economy that benefit males generally. So the growth is really a reductionist measure and doesn't tell us a lot about well-being. Yet, it is this growth perspective that informs what has come to be known and called urban governance. Theoretically or conceptually, the idea of urban governance should be broad and all-embracing, drawing on ideas of decentralization, entrepreneurialism, even democratization. In other words, governing cities beyond the state, beyond the market, to include civil society organization. In practice, that is actually existing urban governance takes the form of a very neoliberal approach to managing cities seen as production machines, and the process of urbanization seen as a way of cranking up that engine of growth. It also takes the form, that is actually existing urban governance, takes the form of international architectural firms or international property development firms producing plans for cities into which local people have no input at all. I think that's what's happening in Kigali, and I understand in Tetu or something in Kenya as well. It does not mean that local people have no voice at all, because simultaneously international NGOs have played considerable role. Local people or urban residents have tried to use the media, for example, to hold the state to account. So it does not mean that voices have been muted. But the scorecard of urban governance doesn't look particularly impressive. Urban inequalities have worsened according to the last State of the African Cities reports. Income poverty, according to a report published by UN Habitat called Unleashing the Economic Potential of African Cities, has also worsened. I want to have dreams like Kumi, not nightmares. So I want to look at things positively. I think African cities can still contribute to development in Africa, but not just development, but a just development. Development that is inclusive through inclusive plan, inclusive and indigenized forms of planning, through public transportation, that is using the visible hand of the state to create more public transport. I think that it's possible to encourage more small-scale urban agriculture, what is called the ruralization of the urban, and even to promote regional integration, in this case, on all fours with Robert. But in my opinion, it's not possible to attain all these if we continue to emphasize GDP. I think a de-emphasis on GDP and an emphasis on broader measures of well-being, such as happiness, could help, but not happiness defined in narrow terms as economists normally define it. In his famous paper, Mathematical Analysis of the Economics of the Family, Gary Becker, Nobel laureate in economic science, defined love as a non-marketed household commodity. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about feelings of cooperation, feelings of togetherness, sharing time, quality time with family, good education, and health. There's considerable research on how this can be done, but there is an important caveat here, and my attention was drawn to it by one philosopher, one Professor White, whose paper appeared in a very recent issue of the Review of Social Economy. According to Professor White, there are some people who are happy to be sad. In other words, there are people who do not want to be happy, and so you cannot use happiness alone to measure well-being. If so, well, an orthodox economist would say that, well, this is noise in the data, and so we should dismiss it. But from my perspective, I think what it means is that even happiness, which is a broader measure, should go hand in hand with other measures of well-being.
Thank you, Franklin Bengadon. For enlightening us also on very obscure definitions of love. I'm jumping right away to Mark Haywood, South Africa. It's been pointed out also with some of the data that was presented earlier. I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Robert Kappel will agree, that South Africa as a country is facing an economic crisis. So I want to look a little bit at the country level now. And apparently there's no real exit strategy in sight. The biggest criticism of the National Development Plan that was presented by the government is that it does not really address the economic crisis at all. I've seen that in a recent interview you pointed out that this crisis has huge ramification for the social fabric of your society because health and education are at risk of further deteriorating because of potential budget cuts. The crisis perpetuates high and persistent unemployment. We were talking about the issue of unemployment, and in particular youth unemployment, one of the biggest issues in also other sub-Saharan African countries. So I want to ask you, what are the critical things the South African government is getting wrong?
Should I say just about everything? I'll try and answer that question. Kirsten, I'd like to just start really where Franklin left off. I mean, he said of South Africa that growth in South Africa has been enclaved and exploitative, I think was his words, and that it's something that should be mourned rather than celebrated. So let me say a few words in defense of Kumi and my country. Because really, you know, I think South Africa has two tales to tell. South African government would like to sell our country as a country that is leading Africa's rising in many respects, a country that has earned the right to lead Africa at forums such as the African Union and so on. And to point to that, it would say that we have the best cricket team in the world. We just beat Australia. We hosted the World Cup, and we built beautiful, beautiful stadiums in Cape Town and Johannesburg, the best modern architecture in the world. We have a fantastic constitution. I'll come back to that in a minute. And of course, we had Nelson Mandela. All of these attributes of a rising African country that began to rise almost exactly 20 years ago. We're almost on the 20th year of our democracy. And all of that would be true, of course. But there's another story to South Africa, as you've hinted. And that story is a very different story. And it's a story which shows that despite sustained economic growth, not at the levels that South Africa would want, and it's going down quite dramatically now, very little has been done to improve the living conditions and the social fabric of people in the country. And just to give you a few examples, you know, South Africa is a country that has a food surplus, but it has 12 million people daily hungry, who suffer hunger on a daily basis. It has a higher level of infant malnutrition than even the most poorest of African countries, which causes permanent stunting in a large percentage of South African children. It has unemployment that sits at a level of 24%, and that is a conservative measure of unemployment. And when it comes to social investments and social systems, I was saying to somebody this morning, it's a terrible thing to say, but in reality, public education is worse now than it was under apartheid in many respects. And that is a shocking admission to have to make. So that's our two stories. Now, what I can say to this convening is that South Africa is perhaps rising in one respect, which is that South Africans are rising and saying that they will not tolerate this situation any longer. At the moment in South Africa, we don't have an Arab Spring in the way that it's seen or depicted, but there are an estimated 4 what we call service delivery protests on a daily basis. These are protests that are spontaneous, that are taking place in communities across South Africa for things like water, for sanitation, for schooling, and so on and so on. We see our labor force is rising. Again, people here will be familiar with what happened in Marikana and the platinum mines, what is going on in the platinum mines at the moment. You know, 2 years ago almost, the mine workers that create this fabulous riches for Lonmin and so on made the outrageous demand that they wanted about €800 a month for their back-breaking work. Absolutely outrageous. And of course, for that, they were justly shot. 34 of them, in fact. But the spirit of those mine workers has not diminished. And as we speak now, we're into the 4th week of a strike on the platinum mines, again, once more for this 12,500 rand a month wage. So I think, you know, the good news that I would say, and perhaps something in which we can see the beginnings of leadership from South Africa, is that people are now looking to alternatives. People are now saying that the mantra, as we've said here, is not a mantra that has brought anything to people. All it has done is create elites. So let me finish just by saying a little bit about what people are doing. Tomorrow in South Africa is budget day. It's going to be once more a conservative budget. The government is shivering because GDP is going around 2%. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They say if they can't reach levels of 5%, they can't produce jobs. So you have to hold off on expectation of jobs until you get to 5%, and you'll never get to 5%. So today, and I'd encourage people, I'll send it round later on, but today outside Parliament in Cape Town, a group of about 60 or 70 civil society organizations pretended that we were the Minister of Finance. And outside of our parliament, we delivered an alternative budget speech, a carefully constructed speech, not just rhetoric and propaganda, but actually a description of another way of investing in the economy and trying to turn the economy around. And what we're saying, and I think it echoes exactly what Robert has said and what Franklin has said, is that there is capacity to invest in social infrastructure, that there's a massive need for investment in public education, there's a massive need for investment in public health, there's massive unemployment, and yet there's massive social needs in all sorts of places. That we have to find ways to employ people in decent work rather than in slave work, which is what is happening in many instances. But also, what Africa has to do and what African people have to do now is to demand accountability from governments. Vast amounts of money are wasted in corruption, and part of Africa's rising is, again, the rising of corruption. Vast amounts of money are lost in tax evasion out of South Africa and all of the other countries where foreign direct investment is going in. And the only solution, frankly, that I would say to this audience is that we have to build strong civil society and that we have to build strong organizations of social justice. I'll finish by saying that, you know, I've been in Europe for the last 5 days. I came to Frankfurt on Thursday night for a conference, and, you know, I've heard a lot in those 5 days that tell me that everybody has a good diagnosis of what is wrong with Africa and what is wrong with the world. And the diagnosis, there seems to be remarkable consensus amongst progressive people on the diagnosis. I think the diagnosis is important, but what we need to start doing is talking about what are the solutions. Because if we don't start implementing those solutions and going to scale on those solutions, so no longer working in little organizations with different country responses fragmented from each other and unaware of each other, if we don't start joining those dots, then it is going to be very difficult to rescue Africa from a further period of decline that is being brought about by the so-called rise of Africa and the new forces that are coming to try to take control of our resources. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark Haywood. I think if we look closer, we find a lot of such examples of how Africans are rising, sometimes against Africa on the rise in the most conventional way, and within a given and dominant economic system. However, I think there's a long way ahead of us. First of all, listening to the voices that speak out on aspirations and the protests we can hear, but also on the question of what is the right solutions, because I'm sure that also in this room we differ a lot still in the analysis and also in the ideas about solution. But having said so, we could deepen the discussion here on the panel. Robert, you want to? Lorenzo, you wanted to react, because otherwise I would like to use the time to give the floor to our participants in the room and ask questions.
Yeah, I think we should start the Q&A.
Yes, thank you. Would you join us? Floor is open for you. We've taken a lot of time already with so many inputs. Please raise your hands so the microphones can go around. And if there's not, I would give Lorenzo the chance to comment as you want to.
Okay. I would like to add myself actually to the list of South Africans that are represented on the panel, because I happen to be a South African citizen as well, and sharing Mark's concerns about the type of development that we've seen in South Africa from '94 onward, but especially in the past decade, that I think is an indication of a type of model that is extremely popular in the rest of Africa as well. And going back to the issue that is the title of the panel, the reason why GDP is a problem. I disagree with Robert that GDP is just one of many statistics, or can be seen as, like one element of a broader statistical and economic knowledge. GDP is a political tool. Okay, so GDP is not simply a number. It is a way of framing what really matters, and making policymakers, making citizens, making the media blind to the rest. Now, I'm not blaming GDP for existing, but the way in which GDP is used is fundamentally political. Now, we shouldn't consider all the things that we have said about rising inequality, environmental degradation, lack of funding for the social development in the case of education, healthcare, and so on and so forth, as something that happens despite GDP growth. I dare say that it happens because of GDP growth. It happens because of the fact that we always use our resources, both human and financial, to support those sectors in society that are more relevant in GDP terms. So there is never money. When a policymaker has to take a decision between building a school and a shopping mall, this is something real that happens in Johannesburg every day. Mark knows very well that informal vendors in Johannesburg have been kicked out of town in order to replace their little flea markets with shopping malls. And the policymaker has only one choice: decides to go against the statistics and support informal economic structures, public parks, and so on and so forth, or build a consumption-based infrastructure like a shopping mall, and in order to push economic growth as it is calculated in GDP terms, and so on and so forth. The consequence is disastrous. The consequence means people are evicted, lack of infrastructure, lack of social infrastructure, because it's considered not valuable, because it's considered something nice to do, not something that has an economic impact. And only those formally productive consumption-based infrastructures will be realized. That's why we managed to build the stadiums for the Soccer World Cup, and we don't manage to build nurseries for children. We don't manage to build schools. We don't manage to invest in schools, and so on and so forth. So when this becomes the way in which we design our policies, we realize that this model of growth is fundamentally flawed. Then we need another way of measuring what counts. We need another way of measuring what is economically productive, so as to get a better idea of how we should spend the little money we have. Going back to the budget speech issue. Thanks.
I would say maybe the stadiums were meant to be economically productive, but then
Well, again,
didn't
you
really
don't want to go
deliver.
there, exactly.
Let's
They're
at least
empty,
assume
yeah.
that there was some goodwill in investing in stadiums. But I will give Robert Kappel a chance to respond directly and maybe then bring in the others. If there's questions, please raise your hand. There's one here in the 6th row. If you can come bring
Okay, thank you very much for this intervention. I'm very much in line with you when you say GDP is a political indicator. And our growth model is a problem. That's absolutely right. But I'm not very familiar with the debates going on the, let's say, green GDP or other measures, which the measure of well-being or luck. Denmark is the country where most of the people are happy. Or so these measures are also quite political, let's say. I agree with you, but so far as an orthodox economist, I don't see not so many alternatives. I see the green GDP, that's very relevant. I see this, and I see also that I also realize that we should include in a new indicator, not called GDP, social development, well-being, access to Luna parks, cinemas, and transport, and health, and clinics, and so on and so forth. I know this, but I don't know how to do it. And for me, it's also can be very useful to work with GDP growth and other indicators, because I also can show that our growth. The main developments in growth is not in favor of the environment, in favor of the people. In many countries, people suffer, and they are in subsistence activities and so on and so forth. I know this, but I can also show with my GDP indicator, for instance, that we have a certain misdirection in our development, and development is not sustainable in the long run. That's for sure. And I can also use my indicator, let's say, to make this clear.
Good. Now,
I don't have any reliable statistics so far, and I know that it's more a conceptual work you're doing, and that's very good. But I need data in order to show whether the direction we are going is right or wrong. So so if you have something which is much better, I will follow you. Sorry.
fine. I would really like to give you the first chance. Pose a question.
Thank you. My name is Antje Berger. I work for the German Institute of Human Rights, and I'm a lawyer by profession, so I don't believe in numbers, but to put it very simple, in laws and the implementation of laws. And I want to pick up the word of Mark, solutions, and pose a question to Kumi. You mentioned the role of the World Bank and the IMF on the impact and solutions with regards to Africa, what they have done wrong and that they could do much better with regards to sustainability. But could you elaborate on those solutions? I know that the World Bank is in the progress to review its safeguards. So what exactly do they have to do in order to enforce the solutions? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. As a lawyer, you say you're not into numbers. You're into the rule of law, maybe. But let me start by saying that the rule of law is part of our problem. Because if you look at when rule of law gets implemented as a concept in literature and in practice, all the injustice, inequalities, and so on that exist before the rule of law all got institutionalized. And if you look at the reality, it's those with power and those with privilege that embrace the rule of law, because basically there's a really good article that came out recently which caused me to question because most of us always embrace rule of law as a good thing. But this is an article that came out of the US, which I think is relevant for this conversation, by the way. It's about how we deal with big macro concepts and do we see them as immutable and beyond questioning and beyond change. And so when Bradley Chelsea Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison, a commentator in the US said the problem with the United States is that we've become a nation of laws and not a nation of justice. And part of what we're dealing here with, because a lot of what happens in the whole development space is very fixed by legal background, sort of documents, contracts, and so on. And the World Bank and the IMF, they're beginning to take some tentative steps in the right direction, but it's too little, too late, I would say. The first thing the bank needs to do is it cannot call itself a global governance institution, right, but be governed on a $1 one vote basis, which means that the rich countries who sit on the governing structure of the World Bank have all the power, really, and lots of decisions are made by the World Bank on Africa, for example. And, you know, there are about 8 or more, actually, I forget the number now, directors of the World Bank that come from European countries, for example. And there's, for all of Africa, there's about 2, right? So the one thing is, the bank cannot be preaching good governance to all the borrowing countries. You must have good governance and so on, when their own governance is so rotten to the core. Because you cannot have an institution that as democratic, speaks democracy and so on, but actually operates in such. So that's the first thing, and the bank acknowledges it, by the way. And I don't know whether you know it, there's a deal that the Americans and Europeans made in 1945, where the head of the IMF is always a European and the head of the World Bank is always an American citizen, right? Like, for example, Jim Wolfensohn, when he became the president of the World Bank, he was Australian, he had to change in his passport and get US citizenship to be actually, yeah, seriously, he told me himself the story, right? So that's at the bigger level. Secondly, there has to be significantly more transparency in the way that the World Bank operates. Do you know, most often we don't know exactly what contracts are signed between our governments and the bank in the detail articulation of it, right? So we need to do much more in terms of transparency. Again, there are steps in that direction. It's steps in the direction, again, I would say, based from a civil society perspective, I'd argue, still too little, too late. However, in terms of where it lands, okay. All right, I'll leave it at that. There are lots more they need to do, and I can talk to you in the break if you want.
Because I think we heard about the World Bank. I would also like to hear about governments on the ground and solutions. That was also part of the question. I have the gentleman here in the second row. I think he holds the microphone, and then Mark was raising his hand. There's more questions. But maybe we collect a couple of questions, and then I will give Mark the floor also. Sorry.
Before I put my question, I give a little bit
Can you talk
statement.
into the mic?
My name is Dr. Bekele from Africa Development Consulting. My problem with GDP is it excludes evolution, organic growth, transformations, innovation, after all, science and technology, and aesthetic development, that means space and time. That is the problem. After having said that, I didn't hear from all of you, in the world there is a kind of international hierarchical, organizations, all states in many African countries are being reproduced by the so-called international community. That means the police, the security, the military, and all these things are products of, international community. That is the problem why African governments, as my friend said, they do not realize what they are doing, because they have never gone through this kind of intellectual development, and the so-called international community believes that it is omnipotent in everything. From that perspective, it manipulates, the world. And I didn't hear, such kind of, very crucial, assessment, without breaking, this chain of dictatorship, which really rules the world. Consulting firms like McKinsey, like Young, and so on, which are, manipulating the African elite. They are destroying, purposely the African society, and they have a system of, destroying almost 1/3 of the African population.
I think I have
Thank
to
you. That must
cut
be
your
answered,
time a little bit short,
Okay, thank you
because
very
I
much.
think your point is well taken. Thank you for that. There's more hands raised here to the gentleman, and then I go back. I've seen some hands. You're sitting very far. You already have a microphone, so you go first.
Thank you. My name is Jana Tomakova, and I'm a student of international relationship and development policy. And my question is, we are talking about growth all the time, and like assuming as if growth would be admirable and just maybe it's GDP, but not maybe happiness. But what about other alternatives? What about like Tim Jackson's assumption that prosperity could be gained without growth, or other alternative models? I would like to hear some debates about this.
Thank you very much. Very important question. We'll address certainly.
If you allow
Merin?
me, I actually have the mic. I'm totally in the back, sorry.
Oh, okay. Then, sorry, you still go first, and then I want the gentleman here in the front to have the microphone. Maybe the lady on the right hand with the microphone can come up and bring it. Thank you.
I think I have two small comments. One is on the political economy itself. Do you know why the university had produced a couple years ago another way of calculating progress, and it is the household distribution system. And as we can see, it's more accurate than the GDP. It really shows the way income is distributed on the world scale, and it's an apartheid system on the world scale, because if you just have $3,100 without having any debt, you belong to 2% of humanity who actually earn more than 50% of the wealth. So these are accurate ways, and we can go into detail how to demonstrate that growth is just a Trojan horse of development, and development itself is a problem. But I will just now come to this so-called progress that the World Bank is achieving. I totally disagree. I think the World Bank has self-criticism processes each 10 years, and basically the political dimension of adjustment, governance, and all of this were structural adjustment measures. What is happening is that the World Bank, as well as all the DAC country of OECDs, are very anxious to see India, China performing other multilateral systems, particularly in Africa. And the only response is through direct investment and war. And I would like to address the geopolitical side of this, because we cannot have an ecologic balanced system with a war and security system. Here in Germany, we have the AFRICOM, which is the base controlling the whole African continent. Most of the Germans even ignore it. Most of the Africans ignore it. So if we want to have solution, we have to address the key reason here, which is the plundering of the continent. And the plundering is the issue. So how can we address this issue in the parliament to help the African people truly? Thank you.
Thanks for coming to the question. Merin.
Good afternoon, Merin Abbas from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, desk officer for Southern Africa. We are dealing at the foundation with the same issues. I'm happy that we have this conference here in Berlin. I have one comment and one question. The comment is, indeed, we can't neglect the role of the World Bank, because they were the promoter of the neoliberal model in the 80s, and that's the consequences and the results why African countries are suffering right now. But nevertheless, we should also talk about the role of the state, and I think we neglect that so far, because if you look into the National Development Program of Mozambique or South Africa, it's very, very progressive. It's everything in it, but what is about the implementation? What's about the political will of the African countries indeed to implement these concepts which were made by the World Bank? That's common. And my question will be concerning the regionalization and the promotion of the regionalization. taking the SADC, the South African Development Community, it was indeed created to promote, it should be the economic integration, but almost 20 years after, it's still nothing happened, and there's difficult to convince the African governments, countries to promote regionalization, because that means that they have to give up sovereignty. So what do you think, how the promotion of regionalization should be supported, and probably also by political actors like foundations, Böll or Friedrich Ebert? Thank you.
Thank you for the two questions. I have, I guess, a short comment, Johnny. Be very brief because we're running out of time, and then
yeah, it's Johnny West from Open Oil. Just to disagree with you on this question of rule of law, I would suggest that we would lose most of those battles. We wouldn't want to have won the ones that we won from an ethical and strategical point of view, but I also disagree tactically. I also think you just given away most of the ballpark by saying the World Bank acts through rule of law. The more you get into it and the more you dissect their methodologies, the more I believe that they are erodable and methodologically unsound. You just give the whole game away if you simply say, we can't do anything within the rule of law. Look what it's produced in the case of Bradley Manning, let's generalize out from that. I think it's dangerous, actually.
Now, I'm wondering, let us try the impossible. Mark had raised his hand, so I start with you, and then I give everybody like 1 minute. You pick on the questions you want to answer, and Lorenzo also, 1 minute. And then we go into a well-deserved break.
In some ways, Johnny West has responded to Kumi in the way that I was wanting to respond. I think I really want to take issue with the suggestion that the rule of law is the problem. There is selective implementation of law. And where poor people are disempowered and have no access or knowledge of the law, then law is used against justice and against poor people. But it doesn't mean that rule of law per se is the problem. And I believe as we look at solutions in Africa around governance and accountability, law becomes absolutely critical. So the challenge is, how do we reappropriate and reconnect law with justice? That is, and with justice and with social justice. And in that respect, I'd just like to say that I think South Africa can lead with the example of our constitution. And just to give you one example, last week we had a judgment in South Africa where a province, one of our 9 provinces, was told to provide furniture to all the schools in the province within 90 days, regardless of any arguments it might make about whether it could afford to provide the furniture or whether it has budget for the furniture, because it is a duty to provide children with quality basic education. You cannot get quality basic education without desks and chairs. So law actually can be a way, I believe, of pushback against the GDP mantra, not in and of itself, but certainly one part of the armory of people who believe in justice.
You have an enforcement structure at work. That's already an advantage. I was thinking I should bring in Lorenzo again. Lorenzo, your 1 minute.
Thank you. Yes, I'm with you. Okay, 1 minute. On Team Jackson's prosperity without growth, I think what we should learn from these exercises and this research is that economic growth does not exist per se. It's only the economic growth reflected in GDP, okay? So if we replace GDP with something else, also our idea of economic growth will change. So we don't have to be being against growth per se doesn't mean much, because growth does not exist. It's reflected in the indicator that we choose. And unfortunately, this indicator can become part of the rule of law. Take Europe, for example. As part of the Stability and Growth Pact, GDP was hardwired into regulations. Nowadays, governments cannot spend more or excess deficit more than 3% of their GDP and debt more than 60% to GDP. So basically, this is to discuss, on the issue of rule of law and how laws can also become repressive. GDP has become part of our constitutional setup. So it's extremely powerful the way in which it ties our hands and it forces us to think within the box rather than outside the box. And going to the issue of regionalization, whether it's in Europe or in Africa, the question is, regionalism for what? If regionalism is to replicate a model of development that has shown all its inconsistencies and its injustices, then I would say no regionalism. If regionalism is designed in a way that promotes a different way of well-being, a different trajectory for our economies, then welcome regionalism. And there are many indicators out there that can replace GDP, substitute GDP, become a part of a dashboard of different indices that could be used tomorrow. All we need to build is the political and civil society pressure on our governments to take the decision, just like in 1934, 80 years ago, the Americans had the power to impose GDP on the rest of the world. We now need the civil society voices to force our governments to do another transition, to move towards another system of developmental trajectory.
Thanks, Lorenzo, for the appeal. I'll give you the word, Franklin.
I will concur with what my colleagues have said. It's hard to add anything more except to highlight the very important point that colleague political economist mentioned about inequality on a world scale. I do think that the discussions should increasingly be focused not only on inequality within particular countries, but also a spatial angle to it. To do so, the role of the state in development generally should be, I think, carefully studied through the use of some kind of empowering education, as a colleague mentioned. Beyond these broad strokes, I'll pass the baton on to Kobe.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to address the rule of law question. There were lots of other things I wanted to do, but in terms of time. But the way I want to answer it is evoke Einstein. Einstein once said, in colloquially, if you do what you always did, you'll get what you always got. Or if you're attempting to address a huge problem, do not use the same frameworks, thinking, and logics that got you in the problem in the first place. But given all the conversations that we've had about measurement, assessment, happiness, and so on, I can't resist the most relevant Albert Einstein quotation for this conversation, which is, not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured counts, okay? But on the question of the rule of law, what I am saying is, I'll speak for myself here. Until Lorenzo's book on GDP, many of us accepted GDP as a given. You know, that's just a reality. What he has done is introduce the important questioning, which might lead somewhere. I think just as we have been as slavish to GDP as, you know, given, immutable, and so on, I think the way rule of law is accepted without any contest, I'm with you in terms of interpretation and so on, so I don't have a disagreement. What my disagreement is that even though you can have our constitution that says protects the poor in multiple ways and so on, we know it's in the application of, right? So I am saying to you, not that we throw rule of law out of the, you know, out of the window, but I think we need a more critical engagement with the macro narrative around and the implication of the rule of law. I'll end with just saying, in the context of us being willing to challenge things, I just would end on fish. So most of us grew up in the development world, in the development thinking. Just raise your hands. Have you at some point heard and embraced the proverb that said, if you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a day. If you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. How many of you that impacted in your life at some point? Okay, about 50%. Okay?
You are counting.
Huh?
You are counting.
I'm counting, yeah. So, but think about this, right? And I would argue that that's actually should be thrown out of the window as a logic right now. Now, that sounds like an outrageous thing to say. By the way, I follow that most of my life. Because if you teach a man to fish, does he have access today of a place where he can go fish, to catch fish. If you teach a man to fish, does he have access to the tools that he needs to fish? If you teach a man to fish, does it get to anybody else in the family? And as my friends in the women's movement say, well, you know, the two things they say. One is, you know, people haven't even asked whether the poor really like fish. And the second thing they say is that, well, actually, we like this proverb, you know, teach a man to fish, because at least we'll have a weekend free to ourselves. But seriously, the question is, it's not a question about technical transfer of skill. It is a question about changing power relations. And if we do not understand that GDP, the way rule of law is implemented, the way the macro narratives and the economic system that we have is in play, we cannot address that with technical, you know, staff development and training, capacity building, all that shit we had to deal with coming from the north. I'm going to say it quite honestly. We need to recognize that what is at stake here is changing of power relations, and we must be willing to do it, which is the point that I was making. I wasn't saying throw away rule of law in its entirety.
Robert, I give you the almost
I
last
also
word.
refer to Einstein. He says, be as simple as possible, but not too simple. So I will go into three aspects. Role of the state. The role of the state, that's a very important topic. Is the African state a neo-patrimonial state, or is it a developmental state? Which country has a developmental state? So I don't know so many in Africa. That's perhaps a problem. No? Okay. Second point, regional cooperation. Very, very important. Marin Abbas said nothing happens. Okay, in SADC perhaps, but we have the East African community, which might be better. The problem is always giving up something from the nation state to a bigger body. That's the biggest problem, and I hope one day it will come in order to have more power of the African regional organization. Third, World Bank. World Bank is no tanker. I think it can be changed. And we have examples that it's changed all the time. For instance, the mainstream economists in the World Bank changed, and we had one, Justin Lifolin, he was against this mainstream economics. He pushed something like an industrial strategy for developing countries. And that was accepted in the World Bank, and there was a slight change for, let's say, 4 or 5 years. Now perhaps there might be a change again against this approach. Fourth, someone said, is prosperity without growth possible? Read John Stuart Mill and you see it's possible. The theory says it's possible, but I ask, where are the actors for such a new model or a new alternative model with a, let's say, not growing economy and perhaps also stagnating economy, which might be a good solution, let's say.
Thank you, Robert Kappel. Thanks to all the panelists, also to Kumi Naidoo. I think there was a lot of food for thought. I'm leaving a little bit confused. Beating Einstein with Einstein leaves me with a big question mark here. On solutions, I think we can discuss further during our coffee break. We have a half hour. We're pretty much on time. I'm glad we are, even though we started late. We have a half-hour coffee break now, meet each other, discuss further, relax, go outside, get a little bit of sun and happiness, and come back happy for a film screening, a very unique film screening. Just a second. And that film was made in Nigeria, in Jigawa State, partly. It's animated, so don't miss it. Come back on time. It's an only 10 minutes film. And it's the world premiere today, so we are very happily announcing that. I want to also say a big thank you to Lorenzo Fioramonti for staying with us all the time in very, very harsh conditions on Skype. Thanks a lot for joining us, Lorenzo, and we'll talk later, and all the best to you.
Thank you.